Remember when Shrouded Hand used to do supernatural topics? Well, I still do, kind of. I just tend to cover whatever random topic takes my interest on any particular week. I don't have much rhyme or reason to what I cover, except that it's got to be creepy and interesting. But yeah, I haven't covered anything really weird in a while, and there is one story that's been running around in my head ever since I heard about it a few days ago. It's a truly bizarre tale, and I've wanted to dig a bit more into it, so here we go. This is the Santa Isabel entity encounter. These events took place in late September 1972 in, of all the inexplicable places, an Ika-Renault car factory in the city of Cordoba, Argentina. The factory is called the Santa Isabel plant. It's a huge industrial complex that, even in 1972, spanned multiple city blocks and consisted of many different warehouse, office and factory buildings connected by roadways. One of the workers there was Mr. Teodoro Merlo, a 56-year-old man who worked overnight as a guard at the Santa Isabel plant. One of the places that he was tasked with overseeing was the changing rooms of the forging section. Teodoro was working there in the early hours of the morning on the 21st of September. At 1:40 AM, Mr. Merlo locked both the access doors to the changing room and made a note of it in his logbook. He then kept guard overnight, and nothing much unusual happened. The cleaners would be arriving at 6 AM, so at 5:40 AM, as was his routine, Mr. Merlo unlocked one of the doors to the changing rooms and went inside. Now, I'll describe the layout of this room a bit better just to set the scene. It was a large rectangular dressing room. In the middle here were showers, then around the outside of the showers were metal lockers for the workers to store their things in. At the back of the room, in the centre, were toilet cubicles, and facing the cubicles on opposite sides of the room were long trough-like wash basins. Teodoro Merlo walked in through the door and proceeded up towards the first wash basin. Here he placed down some towels and soap. There was a light on above this section. On the opposite side of the room, where the other wash basin was located, the light was off, but there was enough ambient light from his area that he could still see over there quite clearly. As he turned to walk towards this other area, he was astonished to see, sitting on the opposite wash basin, an extremely strange figure. The man he saw was very tall, probably about 8 feet. He was also extremely muscular. He was wearing a tight-fitting dark blue outfit. The most strange feature was the creature's head. The skin was completely white and it looked like plaster. Its head was bald and rounded at the top. Its chin was broad and angular. Its eyes were described as slanted and horizontally arranged, but much larger than that of an Asian person. He also saw some darker spots or shadows on the entity's cheeks. Its ears were large and pointed, reaching up much further than a human's would. The pose of the creature was also unusual. It was sitting on the basin with one leg stretched out and the other bent inwards. Its left hand was resting on the basin and the right was reaching up and touching its nose. Mr. Merlo walked towards the entity, ready to confront what he assumed was an intruder. As he got within 3 meters of the thing, he glanced briefly in the mirror which was on the side of the toilet stalls. At this moment he says that there was a sound like metal being tapped on glass, and the light behind him went off. At the same time, the light in the area above the creature came on, and it caused Mr. Merlo to look back in that direction. When he did so, he saw that this strange man had vanished. Teodoro Merlo ran back towards the first wash basin and looked down towards the doorway. He was expecting to see the intruder running out through the door, but there was nobody there. There was a second door into the changing rooms, but that had been locked the whole night, and Mr. Merlo checked it again just to confirm it was still locked. The stalls and the shower were also empty. The only other way this strange man could have got out was through air vents at the back of the room, but again Mr. Merlot checked these and they were closed. It was as if this strange creature had simply evaporated into thin air. After overcoming his shock, Mr. Merlot noted some other strange things. The temperature in the room was unusually hot. His eyes began to itch and tear up, and his vision began to blur. He also developed a painful headache and backache. All of these symptoms lasted for several days. Mr. Merlot didn't report his sighting to his superiors, at least not at first. He was afraid of being accused of neglecting his guard duty by letting an intruder get into the changing rooms. He did, however, make a careful drawing of what he had seen before he finished his shift, and then he returned home. This wasn't the end of his unusual experiences though. What follows might be an even stranger encounter. After going home and resting at 9:30 PM the same day, he got on the bus and headed back to work for another night shift. There were about 25 other people on the bus at the time, and Mr. Merlot sat about 3 seats from the front. Not long into his journey, Mr. Merlot looked up and he spotted in the bus's rearview mirror the face of the entity that he'd seen in the dressing room. This time its features were clearly visible, as it didn't have its hand up over its nose. He could see now that the creature's mouth was very strange. Its upper lip protruded out over the bottom lip. He described it as being like a dog's mouth. Its nose was triangular and made up of straight lines, as if it had been sculpted. He saw 2 brown marks on the cheeks, and there were 2 black lines under each eye. The eyebrows were thin and arching, and they looked as if they had been painted on. The creature, he also noted, did not blink. Mr. Merlot turned around and checked behind him, but he saw no creature, only the other passengers on the bus. When he looked back in the mirror, the reflection of the strange face persisted. He couldn't figure out what was causing this reflected image. He watched the mirror for around 3 minutes. Eventually the face faded away and it was replaced with the normal reflection of the bus and its passengers. Mr. Merlot continued on to work and he completed another night shift without seeing anything else eventful. However, he couldn't rid himself of the memory of what he'd seen in the dressing room and the bus's rearview mirror. He reported the sighting to his superior and a note was made of it. Nobody else was told about this sighting apart from the security staff. Mr. Merlot also said that he felt that this incident wasn't taken very seriously by his superiors. After that he didn't see the entity again, but he did have a couple of strange things happen to him. At 2 AM on the 25th of September, Mr. Merlot and a colleague went to unlock the changing room and they found that none of the lights would switch on. At this point Mr. Merlot became too afraid to enter the room, so they just locked the door and left it closed. When they returned to the room a few hours later, the lights seemed to be working fine. Also on the 9th of October, Mr. Merlot noticed that both his wristwatch and the clock in his bedroom said that it was 4 AM. When he checked the clock in another room, it said it was 5 AM. The 5 AM clock was correct. It was as if Mr. Merlot and his bedroom had lost an hour somehow. So far, pretty weird, but I suppose you could always say that Teodoro Merlot was just hallucinating or having some kind of mental break, or even just making the whole thing up. Not that I'm saying he is, just that if you wanted to look at these things skeptically, then the testimony of one man is pretty easy to dismiss when there's no proof. These things always get a lot more interesting when other people see the same thing, and that seems to be what we have here. Enrique Marino was a 19-year-old administrator at the Ika-Renault plant. His job was in the teletype department, and he was tasked with distributing documents to various places in the complex. He would travel around the plant on a motorbike with a trailer on the back. In this trailer he would carry documents from one building to another. at around 10:30 p.m. on the 27th of September. So this was 6 days after Mr. Merlot's sighting. Enrique Marino was in the engineering office dropping off some documents as usual. He was so used to this routine that he didn't even turn the light on in the office. He just dropped the papers on the table and was turning to leave. As he did so, the lights above his head flickered on and off 3 times. This, he noted, was unusual because these were fluorescent lights and they usually flicker when they come on, but this time they just came on and off without flickering. Immediately after the light went out for the 3rd time, he heard a loud humming noise like a turbine very close by. He also found this very strange because there wasn't any machinery operating nearby and he couldn't think of anything that would make that particular noise. He started to get pretty weirded out, but nevertheless he just continued on his rounds. At 11:13, as noted in his logbook, he was finished with his duties, and so he set out on his bike to make his way back towards the guard office and clock out. On his way there, he says he noticed something far away in the distance that looked like a rainbow. It was glowing very close to the ground, but he didn't pay much attention to it. As he got closer to the guard office, he passed by a row of vehicle chassis that were piled up along the side of the road. Behind the row of chassis, he saw a strange figure walking there. From a distance, he could only see the man's blue-green coloured clothing, and he thought that it might be a worker wearing green overalls, but from the height of the man he seemed to be abnormally tall. He was half expecting it to turn out to be somebody on stilts playing a joke, but as he got to within 30 feet of the creature, it slowly turned round to face him, and he saw that this wasn't any worker. The way the creature turned was highly unusual. As it turned its torso, its head and arms followed, as if those parts of the body were stuck to the trunk and unable to turn independently. As soon as the entity faced him, the engine on Mr. Marino's bike began to falter and the vehicle shuddered and slowed down. He put the bike into 2nd gear and pressed it on, but it just continued to decrease speed until, just as the bike was directly in front of the creature, it came to a complete halt. The report describes how the engine didn't actually stop. It continued to run, but it was as if the bike's wheels were just nailed to the ground. The picture here shows Mr. Marino's position as he got close to the entity. The man in the foreground shows where his bike stopped. Mr. Marino is behind the chassis, showing where the creature stood. This creature was extremely massive, about 7.5 to 8 feet tall and very muscular. Its clothing looked to be made of a plastic material and it was a bright glowing blue-green colour. Its skin looked to be slightly green, but Mr. Marino wasn't sure if it was actually just white and the green colour was simply reflecting off its clothes. It also had on a silver belt with a large buckle and what looked like a holster or a box on the side. The face of the thing was very similar to what our first witness, Mr. Merlot, had seen, except that there were some differences. This creature did have a bald head, but it was described as being more angular. It had a wide jaw and the same triangular nose. All of its features seemed to be made up of straight, sharp lines, and it looked as if it had been sculpted. The ears were large and pointed, and they extended up above the top of the head. The eyes were round and yellow, looking like big light bulbs. He says that there were no eyebrows, eyelashes, or any other hairs on the creature's head. The mouth was just a thin, straight line. He said that it appeared to be robotic rather than being a living creature. Mr. Marino also experienced some physical effects. As he got close to the creature, he heard a loud ringing noise in his ears, and he felt a pressure as if someone was covering his ears. He also felt a tingling sensation in his body, and he found that he was unable to move any of his limbs. He only seemed to be able to move his head. He also noticed that it was very hot in that area, despite it being a cool night, and there was this odd smell in the air like burning oil. He estimates that he remained motionless in front of the creature for around 30 seconds. During this time, neither he or the creature moved. Then suddenly he felt a jolt, and it was as if his bike was propelled to the left and through a warehouse door, with him still riding it. So I am translating these events from the original Spanish report, so hopefully there's not too much lost in translation, but it says that at this point his senses were still dulled and he felt as if he wasn't actually in control of his bike, but he still managed to maneuver it towards the guard room, turning multiple times even though the bike was travelling at around 50 miles an hour in an area with a 5-mile-per-hour speed limit. He seems to be unsure whether he was actually controlling the bike out of instinct or if the bike was just being controlled by some unseen force. The next thing he knows, he's screeching to a halt, almost hitting the security barrier outside the office and earning himself a telling off from one of the guards. Another strange thing happened here. As he got to the guard office, the 11:30 siren went off, which signalled the end of his shift. Enrique Marino found this very surprising. He kept a meticulous record of his movements in his logbook. He'd finished dropping off the last set of documents at 11:13, then he'd driven over towards the guard office before seeing the strange creature. He estimated that his encounter with the creature took around 30 seconds. The journey itself would only have taken a couple of minutes. This means that he took 17 minutes to get from where he was, see the creature and arrive at the guard office. He couldn't account for this missing time. Even stranger still, when he checked his watch, it still said 11:13 and it was stopped. Later analysis of the watch showed that it had been highly magnetized. He told the guard what he had seen, and the two of them returned to the area where Mr. Marino had seen the entity, but there was nothing there. However, when they checked behind the chassis in the area where he had seen the thing standing, they saw two rectangular depressions in the ground. The ground around these markings were unusually warm. At first, the guards just dismissed the sightings. They were making jokes and mocking Mr. Marino for seeing things, but they noticed that he appeared to be very sick. He'd gone very pale and faint, so they took him to the on-site medical office. It was here that Mr. Marino passed out. It was found that he had extremely low blood pressure, and so an ambulance was called. By the time the ambulance arrived, Mr. Marino was starting to recover, so instead of going to the hospital, the ambulance just took him back home. As they were travelling towards his house, Enrique Marino says that a whole host of strange words and numbers flashed through his mind. When he was later asked about these numbers and words, he said that he was unable to recall them exactly, except that they seemed to be coordinates, and he remembered the number 18. As they neared his home, Mr. Marino asked to be taken to his girlfriend's house instead. His girlfriend took him in and he lay down on the sofa. He appeared to be in an extremely agitated state, repeatedly saying that he'd seen a mechanical man. Eventually he passed out on the chair, but even in his sleep he appeared to be convulsing and trembling with fear. This wasn't Enrique Marino's only encounter with the mechanical man. The following day he'd calmed down enough to return to work, so at around 10:30 PM he was collecting papers in one of the office buildings. He suddenly felt a strange sensation come over him. He said it was as if he knew he was being watched. He looked up and saw out of the window the very same creature that he'd seen the night before. It was standing in an empty patch of waste ground about 3 meters away. At the moment that he saw the creature, the fluorescent lights in the office began to switch on and off, and he again heard that humming noise that sounded like a turbine. He was rooted to the spot in fear for just a moment. Then he sprinted out of the room and went to the security office, where he attempted to get one of the guards to come and see the mechanical man. Now, from what the reports say, it seems that the guards thought that Mr. Marino was having some sort of mental breakdown. They just told him to sit down and have a coffee with them. They explained to him that his obsession with this mechanical man was causing him to hallucinate. They also told him to keep quiet about the sighting, not to relate it to any of his superiors for fear that his mental stability might be questioned. The reports also don't mention anything else after this incident. I assume that Mr. Marino didn't see the creature again, or at least he kept quiet about it if he did. But there is one more witness. This is 52-year-old truck driver Lufthold Rodriguez. It was around 3:40 AM on September the 28th, so this was about 4 hours after Enrique Marino had seen the mechanical man whilst he was riding his motorbike. Mr. Rodriguez was delivering sheet metal to the Santa Isabel plant. After he dropped off his cargo, he was sat in the driver's seat of his truck preparing to depart. He then noticed that the area around the truck lit up from some unseen light source. Then someone came walking down the right-hand side of his truck. At first he couldn't see who it was because they stood taller than the truck, so he could only see their torso through the side window, but he could tell that this was a massively tall, muscular person. The person or creature walked in front of the truck, and there he got a much better look at it through the windshield. It reached the right-hand side of the truck's bumper, and then it suddenly stopped, turned and looked at him. At the exact same moment, the truck's engine stopped, the headlights went out, as did the streetlights that were nearby. He could still see the creature, however, because it was carrying a spherical object in its hand which emitted a glowing white light. He noticed how, when it turned, its head and arms moved unnaturally as if they were firmly fixed to the torso and unable to turn independently. Mr. Rodriguez also felt a strong buzzing sensation in his head, and he felt completely immobilized. The truck began to shake violently, so much so that a transistor radio fell off the dashboard and broke. After turning to look at him, the creature turned back and continued on its way, walking towards a building and disappearing around the corner. He noticed as it walked it didn't bend its legs and had to rock from side to side as it shifted its weight between each foot. His description of the creature matched Mr. Marino's almost exactly. A flat, bald head, an angular face that looked sculpted, a triangular nose and thin mouth, round bulb-like eyes, pointed bat-like ears. Its clothes were also the same bright green plastic material with a large silver belt and holster. He described the creature's body as being very tall, about 8 to 8.5 feet, and it was of an athletic build, although he said that the body seemed unnatural, as if it was just a shell. He also noticed that it was wearing silver rectangular boots. As soon as the creature had walked out of sight, then all the other effects, the head buzzing, the truck shaking, the immobilization, stopped. Still, Mr. Rodriguez was so shocked by the encounter that he sat motionless for 2 to 3 minutes until a passing workman asked him what was wrong. He told them about the sighting, and a number of employees searched the area, but they found nothing. It seems that that was the end of Mr. Rodriguez's experiences. Unlike the other 2 witnesses, he doesn't appear to have had a second encounter with the creature. Now, as far as I can tell, the 3 witnesses were completely unknown to each other, and none of them knew about each other's sightings. It seems that after Enrique Marino and Lufthold Rodriguez had their sightings, word somehow got around about the similarity between them, and at that point, I'm not sure, either a journalist got hold of the story or they simply got together and decided to go public, because their testimonies were published in a local newspaper. Our first witness, Teodoro Merlo, was still pretty much unknown by this point. He only came to light after a UFO researcher named Dr. Oscar Galindez got involved. He'd read the testimonies in the paper and he travelled to the area to talk to some senior management at the Ika-Renault plant. He was then told that there was a third witness, Mr. Merlo, but he seemed very reluctant to come forward. He was eventually convinced by a senior manager. Dr. Galindez interviewed Mr. Merlo at the senior manager's house, but he had to promise that he wouldn't show his photo in the report. Dr. Galindez eventually interviewed all 3 witnesses, and he was struck by how earnest and humble each one of them was. He was completely convinced that each man was telling the truth. So, what happened here? I suppose we've got to look at some skeptical explanations here. Probably the one thing you've got to eliminate is whether or not the three men were simply lying, making up the story for some strange reason. It seems unlikely simply because all three witnesses faced a significant amount of ridicule for coming forward with their stories, and they possibly jeopardised their jobs at the plant. It would also mean that they somehow came up with the same lie independently of each other. I suppose it is feasible that somehow word got around. I've noticed that one constant between the witnesses seemed to be that the security personnel were the first ones to hear about it, so I suppose rumours could spread among the security personnel in different departments and somehow then get to the staff members who decided to make up a story of their own. Again, it seems unlikely just because why wouldn't they make up a story just to face ridicule, but just because it seems unlikely doesn't mean that it's impossible. It's also possible that someone created a giant mechanical man outfit and stomped around the plant at night scaring random employees. It's a huge factory and there would be a lot of materials available, and the people who had manufacturing know-how who could possibly have built such a thing. Maybe someone cobbled together a weird alien outfit in their spare time. I've worked a few factory jobs and I know the kind of things that people get up to when they're bored, so it's entirely within the realms of possibility, I suppose. This wouldn't explain some of the other effects though, the feeling of pressure and the sound of ringing in the heads of the witnesses, the sensation of being rooted to the spot, the spontaneous mechanical malfunctions of their vehicles which suddenly would spring back to life moments later. Mr. Merlot's sighting in the bus's rearview mirror might be the most intriguing detail here. If he was lying, then why would he include this detail? It just seems so out of place compared to the rest of the experience. It also discounts the idea of it just being a prank, because when he turned around he would have seen it there on the bus with him. If I had to come up with a halfway plausible, skeptical rundown of the events, it would be something like this. Teodoro Merlot, the first witness, possibly did see something. He may have had a mental breakdown or an episode of psychosis, a mini stroke, and this caused him to hallucinate this strange person or entity. We know that after his sightings he made a sketch of what he saw, and he also sculpted the head in clay. We know that the security personnel at the plant heard about the description, and it's also very possible that they saw the sketch. From there, with word spreading around the factory, somebody, I don't know who, built an outfit that looked very similar to what Mr. Merlot had seen. Notice how with the next two sightings, which came a few days later, there are subtle differences from what Mr. Merlot saw. Teodoro Merlot had seen a round-headed, slanted-eyed creature with markings on its cheeks and below its eyes. It also had thin eyebrows. The other two witnesses saw something with a squarish head, round eyes, no markings or eyebrows. Could it mean that somebody attempted to recreate the creature and didn't get it exactly right? Then all they would have to do is walk around a few times at night and spook a couple of unsuspecting employees. Note that all the witnesses kept very tight schedules and regular routines, so it's highly likely that someone, for example the security staff, would know that those people would definitely be there at certain times of the night. What about the other effects? The buzzing in the head, the headaches, and the sensation of being rooted to the spot? The only thing I can think of is these were simply the effects of extreme shock or fear from seeing the creature. The vehicle malfunctions could have been a coincidence perhaps, or maybe there was some kind of mechanical tomfoolery going on. I don't know though. If it was just a prank, then it would be an extremely elaborate one. I think it would be difficult to replicate some of those effects using today's technology, let alone what they had in the 1970s. It gets to the point where the skeptical explanations become almost as implausible as the paranormal ones. For all we know, there really was a buff robot alien wandering around a random car factory in Argentina in late September of 1972. There were some other sightings, although these are slightly more dubious. Dr. Galindez was told by security personnel that a number of people had reported seeing glowing lights in the sky around the same time as the sightings of the creature. Apparently 2 people, independently of each other, had seen some kind of craft hovering very close to the factory, then send down a column of light, or what was described as a crystal tube, and kind of hoover up a creature from the ground that looked very similar to the entity that was seen by the 3 men. Unfortunately, it seems that these witnesses were either unable or unwilling to come forward to officially give their testimonies, so we only have word of mouth here. It's worth mentioning, but again, slightly dubious because we haven't got first-hand testimony. So yeah, I don't know what to make of this story. It's just one that I heard about a few days ago and I've been kind of fascinated by it, but after researching it, I still don't know. If it was just a prank, how did they cause someone's watch to stop and their motorbike to be rooted to the ground? How did they cause the image of a face to appear in a bus's rearview mirror? There's a lot of things that don't really add up to this story, and that's probably why I find it so intriguing. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. Is it fakery, fiction, or a genuine occurrence of the paranormal? I just don't know. Anyway, if you like this kind of thing, I will point you to my video on the Sandown Clown. If you haven't seen that already, then go check it out. This happened on the Isle of Wight, and it happened just 8 months after these Argentina sightings. It's not exactly the same thing, but it is a tall humanoid with a white face, pointed ears or antenna, strange markings on the cheeks, and strange artificial looking features. Could the 2 events be linked somehow? Maybe. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. So, big thank you for watching, and a huge thank you to everyone on Patreon who is supporting the channel. Thank you very much. Okay. See you next time, everyone. Goodbye.